as a parent, as a teacher, as a minister, and as a counselor that I always love to have is to witness opportunities that I like to call discovery moments. Moments where people put two and two together. Perhaps the moment that as a parent you start to watch your kid crawl for the first time, or where they first begin to start mimicking what you're doing, or perhaps when they're walking, or in Joshua's case, starting to run rather than even walking to start. Or as a camp counselor, when you see a kid accept Jesus Christ for the first time in their lives. Or as a teacher, when you're trying to teach them something that just has been a source of trial, and then finally they understand that 1 + 1 is 2. And then they get it together, and they have that light bulb moment. Isn't that kind of a little bit like us? We have light bulb moments and discovery moments in our own lives as well. Sometimes we learn the same lesson over and over again. Some of us learn the lesson of patience over and over again, or perhaps submitting to God over and over again. And in our scripture this morning, we're going to see 3 different discoveries from different perspectives in the story this morning. The point that we're going to discovery that we're going to make together is that we cannot escape our past, and that comes with we can't escape the results of our decisions, or we can't escape that punishment. Secondly, we need to have faith for the lifetime, not just faith for the moment. And the final discovery that we're going to make is that we might have God's grace in the appearance of judgment, or God's providence and sovereignty in our lives. Let's look together. Our scripture passage is Jonah chapter 1, verses 8 through 17, as we continue in our sermon series on Jonah. And it says, "So they asked him, 'Tell us, who is responsible for making all this trouble for us? What do you come to do? Where do you come from? What is your country? From what people are you?' He answered, 'I am a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the land.' This terrified them, and they asked, 'What have you done?' They knew he was running away from the Lord, because he had already told them so. The sea was getting rougher and rougher, so they asked him, 'What should we do to you to make the sea calm down for us?' 'Pick me up and throw me into the sea,' he replied, 'and it will become calm. I know that it is my fault that this great storm has come upon you.' Instead, the men there did their best to row back to land, but they could not, for the sea grew wilder than before. Then they cried out to the Lord, 'O Lord, please do not let us die for taking this man's life. Do not hold us accountable for killing an innocent man, for you, O Lord, have done as you pleased.' Then they took Jonah and threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. At this, the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him. But the Lord provided a great fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was inside the fish 3 days and 3 nights." Here ends our reading this morning. Setting out from Hamburg, Germany, to do a concert in London, England, a violinist, Fritz Kreisler, had about an hour before he had to get on his boat. And he was just trying to, spend some time. And so he goes into a music store. And he's in this music store, and he's carrying around his violin. And the proprietor notices Mr. Kreisler. And he comes up to him, and he says, "Hi, how are you doing?" And he kind of looks at the violin for a moment, and he says, "Can I just see your violin for a moment?" And he looks at the violin, and he's looking at it, and he gives it back to Mr. Kreisler and leaves he says, "I got to go for a moment." And about 5 minutes later, 2 policemen arrive. And they come up to Mr. Kreisler, and they say, "Excuse me, sir, you are under arrest." And Mr. Kreisler says, "What have I done? I haven't done anything." And the proprietor says, "You stole Fritz Kreisler's violin." And he's kind of flabbergasted. He doesn't know what to do. And so this ordeal, they're trying to pester him, and he's losing precious time because his boat's about ready to leave. And so finally Fritz Kreisler says, I am Fritz Kreisler. Just let me play a tune for you and you'll know that I am who I say I am. And so they let him, and he takes out his violin and he plays one of the pieces that he's absolutely known for and plays it brilliantly. And finally the policemen decide that he is Fritz Kreisler. He is who he says that he was, and he could not escape who he was. Our first point is that we can't escape who we are, and we can't escape the consequences of our decisions. So Jonah witnesses the sea getting rougher and rougher. He witnesses the sailors casting lots right before him, and he finally gets to the point that he admits to those around him who he is. And as after they're kind of asking him who he is, he gives more than just a passing glance at who he identifies as. He says, my name is Jonah. And it's not just like how we introduce ourselves, where we might say, my name is Mike and my favorite color is blue and I like my steak medium rare. It's more than just that, right? Because Jonah gets into who he is. First he says that he is Jonah. And then he says, I am from from the land of the Hebrews, or I am a Hebrew. Now this specifically would basically be an identification not only of who he was ethnically, but also would go back to a specific location where he was in the nation of Israel. Now if I were to say I am Dutch, it doesn't have the same implications. While I'm 97 or 90 in the 90% of Dutch is all over the place now. It's not going to a specific location. I could be from Illinois, I could be from the Netherlands, I could be from the Southwest Michigan area, or various parts all over the country. And when he says that I am Hebrew, this is a term that they would have used to outsiders. And we see this in Joseph uses this in Genesis as he's identifying himself to the cupbearer and to the bread maker. He says this, I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews. And so not only does he say that he was forcibly carried off from the land of that he's from the Hebrews, but he says that he also fears the Lord. And you'll notice in your text that they have the Lord appears in all capital letters. That's referring to a very specific term in the Hebrew form of Yahweh is the actual Hebrew word there, and that's how the Hebrews would identify God, Yahweh. And he also says, I serve the Lord of heaven and earth, who rules the sea and the dry land. This is also a term that they go back to. Abraham uses this in Genesis, as well as Paul in the book of Acts. It says in the book of Acts, as Paul is addressing the people in Athens, he says, the God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples made by human hands. Now, they asked Jonah what he's done, but Jonah really never states who he is, although that is very essential, or his occupation as a prophet is very essential to the core of who he is, and he's dealing with the repercussions of his decisions. It's really interesting, as we're going to contrast later, the sailors in their faith who are supposed to be pagan, and you have Jonah, the prophet, who's supposed to be the religious one and is absolutely anything but. And Jonah is in the right place at the right time. Even though Jonah isn't really in the place that he's supposed to be, God works for the good of himself, and he's able to share this story to the sailors. So finally, Jonah comes to grips with the decision that he's made. He went against God. He went the complete opposite way, and he knows that the sea is going to get rougher and rougher, and the only way that it's going to get calm is to go and to cast himself into the sea. And so he goes to them, and he says in verse 12, pick me up and throw me into the sea, and it will become calm. I know that it is my fault that this great storm has come upon you. It's interesting. Jonah's response is remarkably similar to David's response as God is plaguing the people because of counting the number of fighting men. 1 Chronicles 21:17 says, David says to God, "Was it not I who ordered the fighting men to be counted? I am the one who has sinned and has done wrong. These are but sheep. What have they done? O Lord my God, let your hand fall upon me and my family, but do not let this plague remain on your people." Jonah discovered it's his punishment, and he needs to accept it. And it's interesting that he does that, because we in our lives, we tend to be distancers or people who close in on things. And let me explain what I mean. Suppose there's a report that goes onto a desk. If it's a good report, you want to emphasize how much you had to do with that report. Even if all you did was set it on the desk and staple it, you might have said, "I was essential to the delivery process of this report," right? You want to make sure that you are as close to this report as possible. But if it's a bad report, "Oh, I didn't do that. I wasn't related to that. All I did was staple it and set it on your desk. Don't shoot the messenger. I just brought this to you. I'm not really associated with it." Does that sound like how we are? Well, Jonah doesn't escape what he's done. He's accepted what he's done, and he's going to live with that decision. He knows that he needs to go into the sea for the salvation of these sailors. Do we discover that we cannot escape our identity, or that we can't escape the consequences of our decision, just like Jonah couldn't escape who he was, both as a prophet and his decision to go against the Lord? Are we willing to accept the results of our decisions, both good and bad? One night there's a house fire, and a little boy crawls up to the top of the roof, and he's looking down, and his father is yelling, "Jump! Jump, son, I will catch you. I'm going to catch you." And the son's looking down, and he sees a bunch of smoke. He sees ash. He can't see a thing. And he says, Daddy, I can't.